Nuclear accidents make headlines. Fukushima Daiichi, 3 Mile Island, Windscale, and of course, Chernobyl. But for all the accidents that make headlines, there are dozens that don't, sometimes due to general disinterest because they aren't deemed impactful to the general public. But then there are the accidents that are kept secret, even though they are known to have caused possible harm to the public. One such incident took place in 1959 in Southern California, but even today, it rarely even registers in the public consciousness. I'm your host, David, and today we're going to look at the history and legacy of the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. This is the Cold War. So, this story starts in 1947 in Southern California in the West San Fernando Valley, south of Santa Susana in the Simi Valley, and west of the present-day Los Angeles suburb of Chatsworth. It was in this hilly, scrub-covered terrain that North American Aviation acquired a 2,850-acre piece of land. North American, one of the largest aviation contractors in the United States, needed a space for testing new technology and equipment, and the remote location was ideal. There was a relatively low population in the surrounding area, but it was still close enough to the burgeoning defense industry that had grown so dramatically during the Second World War, and seemed to be continuing with the onset of the Cold War conflict with the Soviet Union. North American took the site and divided it into 4 sections, or sites. Over the following 6 decades, the sites were used by a variety of different firms and government agencies to conduct tests and experiments. It hosted 10 different nuclear reactors and witnessed over 30,000 rocket engine tests. While the Santa Susana site certainly played a key, if unsung, role in America's Cold War, it has left a legacy of environmental destruction, human suffering, and firms and organizations attempting to renege on commitments of restitution. Okay, so let's start with sites 1 through 3, which were used for rocket testing. North American was a leader in the 1940s in the development of rocket engines and eventually created a specialized subsidiary, Rocketdyne, in 1955. The development of these rockets was crucial for military purposes in the deepening Cold War and was key for both cruise missile and ICBM technology. It was Rocketdyne that began development of the SM-64 Navajo supersonic cruise missile, with much of the testing happening on the rocket test frame at Santa Susana. Well, the SM-64 never really came to fruition, supplanted by the SM-65 Atlas and canceled in 1958. The booster engine technology that Rocketdyne had developed was used in a variety of rockets that came into service, including Atlas, Redstone, Thor, Jupiter, Mercury Redstone, and Juno. Rocketdyne was also directly involved in the development of the booster for the Saturn I rocket and the multi-stage rocket system for the Saturn V, both integral to the Apollo program. And the facility at Santa Susana was a central site for this equipment, with over 30,000 tests being carried out before the facility was closed in 2006. So all this might sound positive: high-tech jobs in a burgeoning field, coupled to rapid scientific, technological, and engineering progress. Except that these tests left substantial destruction behind them in the form of deep environmental damage. Soil samples taken at the site in 2006 indicated substantial levels of petroleum products like diesel, hydrazine, and kerosene fuels, as well as chlorinated compounds such as trichloroethene, 1.1.1 chloroethene, and polychlorinated biphenyls. The report also showed the presence of organic solvents, volatile and semi-volatile organic compounds, oxidizers, asbestos, 1.4 dioxane, and mercury, as well as other heavy metals. These chemicals and others built up in the ground over time, either from the rocket burn process, accidents, or more often, the disposal method of leftover material. Disposal of unwanted compounds, including fuel, was often done by simply pouring it out and burning it. This practice was extremely common between 1958 and 1971, at which time concerns and laws over air pollutants forced a halt to open-air burning. The practice was illegally continued, however, something that came to the public attention in 1994 after an explosion killed 2 workers at the site. Specific records to the amounts of material disposed of in this way are largely unavailable, the result of a standard practice at the Santa Susana site to refrain from keeping these specific records. Now, I mentioned that Santa Susana played host to 10 different nuclear reactors over its lifetime. North American Aviation had created a subsidiary in 1955, Atomics International, specifically to deal with the nuclear technology business that it was heavily involved in. It was one of the primary contractors of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, tasked with development of nuclear technology for both commercial and government purposes. At Santa Susana, these experiments were hosted at Site 4 and were designed not for mass energy production, but rather for practical experimentation with new designs and technology. One of these reactors, the SRE, or Sodium Reactor Experiment, tested the use of sodium as the cooling agent in the reactor process instead of water, and it was involved in what may be the worst radiological disaster in U.S. history. The reactor itself came online at Site 4 in 1957 and became the first reactor in California history to sell energy to the public energy grid. Now, what we need to keep in mind as we now look at the series of events that were to follow is that A, the SRE design was a new concept and was experimental in nature, and B, nuclear power in general was still a brand new field. The world's first nuclear power plant designed to generate electricity for a grid had only come online in the summer of 1954 in Obninsk, and the world's first full-scale power plant, Calder Hall in the UK, had only come online in October 1956. In an experimental facility like the Santa Susana SRE, it meant that there was an intersection of new designs, including fuel designs based on theory instead of practice, and the cladding on those fuel cells was previously untested in the world. So the SRE combined new technology with a lack of experience and institutional knowledge for workers for the SRE to fall back on. After coming online in 1957, the SRE would be used to test specific conditions and parameters related to the operation of the plant. Runs would be conducted, with the reaction being stopped in between runs to analyze results, make changes, and coordinate for future runs. During Run 8, conducted between November 29, 1958 and January 29, 1959, a black residue was noticed on the fuel elements as they were being inspected. This was combined with a wide temperature spread between the top and the bottom of the reactor chamber, over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. A temperature spread of less than 100 degrees was to be expected, but it was found that by washing the residue off the fuel elements, the temperature spread was reduced to acceptable levels. It took until January 7th during the run to recognize that tetraline, a hydrocarbon used on the pump seals, had leaked into the sodium coolant and was reacting to form naphthalene, which was collecting in the channels through which the sodium ran. It was concluded, though, that by jiggling the rods, the deposits would dislodge and the reactor temperature would return to a more normal distribution. These anomalous temperature fluctuations continued through the next few runs. At the end of Run 13, from May 27, 1959 to June 3rd, the issue presented again, and the conclusion was again reached that tetraline had once again leaked into the sodium. The run was ended in order to replace the leaking pump. There was also an attempt to clean the fuel elements. However, during the process conducted on June 4th, to use the words from the Atomics International SRE Fuel Element Damage Report, a, quote, pressure excursion occurred. There was an explosion as water from the wash process interacted with trapped sodium that wasn't able to drain because of the tetraline leak. While there was a radiation spike, it was deemed to be, quote, not an unexpectedly high value, end quote, and beyond a suspension of using water in the wash process and allowing for a 10-day rest period to let the radiation decay, no further steps were taken. Run 14 of the SRE was begun on July 12, 1959, and issues presented themselves almost immediately. Within 6 hours of the reactor being started, a reactor scram was instigated, that is, an emergency shutdown, due to a loss of auxiliary primary sodium flow, resulting in abnormally high reactor temperatures. Less than 30 minutes later, the reactor was restarted and the testing was continued at low levels of power production. On the afternoon of the 12th, a spike in airborne radiation was monitored, but after a controlled shutdown and testing, all was found to be in order. The next day, as Run 14 was continued, a temperature and radiation spike were both monitored, simultaneously with a sudden increase in power generation from 2 megawatts to 14 megawatts over a 2-minute period, resulting in a scrammed shutdown of the reactor that needed to be manually initiated due to a failed switch. The switch was repaired, and the run continued over the next several days, with radiation, temperature, and power spikes continuing to be observed and the reactor being stopped and restarted multiple times. This continued until the 23rd of July, when another scram was conducted due to excessive temperature differentials between the top and bottom of the core. It was only at this point that it became apparent that 4 of the reactor elements were stuck, and that jiggling them to clear the blockages in the core channel was no longer successful. With these elements stuck, controlling the reaction was difficult, and multiple scrams were performed. By the 26th, Run 14 was ended, and the reactor was fully shut down. Examination of the fuel cells was begun to determine the reason why the reactor had been running hot. Although not all elements were able to be visually inspected, a result of them being stuck, multiple cells were found to have damage, including pieces of the stainless steel cladding being missing. A full analysis began to be conducted to determine what had gone wrong in order to make changes to the technology and the process. While this was going on, efforts were made to dislodge the stuck elements, something that took until October of 1959 to complete. Okay, so that chain of events is all taken from the Atomics International Report, filed on November 15, 1959. It's a fairly detailed report, and for those of you interested, it can be readily found online if you want a not-so-quick read. The report does detail the environmental monitoring that was going on before, during, and after Run 14, looking to see if there was possible radiological contamination of the Santa Susana site and beyond. The report concludes that, quote, SRE operations have not been responsible for the release of any significant quantities of radioactivity to the environments, at least above that normally accompanying periods of rainfall or fallout following nuclear tests. What the report does not indicate, however, is the method by which the trapped radiation from the spikes was helped to release, by opening vents and doors to vent directly into the environment. Since the reactor, like all of the ones that would be used at the Santa Susana site, was only classified as a low-power experimental unit, no containment shell was necessary, allowing direct venting to the outside. So, how would it be possible that venting was occurring, but no traces of it were found in the reports? Well, the answer to that is provided in what was being measured in 1959. Atomics International was looking for xenon-133 and krypton-85. What they weren't looking for is iodine-131 or cesium-137. Given the incompleteness of records, it has come down to some guesswork in terms of how much radiological contamination may have occurred in 1959 at the SRE. Indications are that anywhere between 15 and 30% of the iodine-131 and cesium-137 may have been released. These claims would put the amount of radioactivity released at about 260 times more than what was released at 3 Mile Island in 1979. Steps were taken to improve safety following Run 14. Tetraline was eliminated as a pump sealant, the sodium system was modified to help prevent blockages, the fuel cell wash system was changed from water to steam to help prevent the chance of explosions, and overall, better instrumentation and fuel element geometry systems were introduced to help measure the reactor systems. In total, after the completion of Run 14, the SRE was run for a further 26,716 hours. The SRE was decommissioned in 1964, having completed its run of tests. But, having just mentioned 3 Mile Island, the 1959 Santa Susana radiological leak was not publicly acknowledged until it was almost accidentally uncovered in the investigation into the 3 Mile Island meltdown. That's a full 20 years after the events I've just been describing. During that time, tens of thousands of people had moved into the West San Fernando Valley, close to the Santa Susana site. Even after the 1979 disclosure, little attention was given to the site, which continued to operate, testing rockets and reactors. Like most long-term industrial sites, accidents occurred, including at least 2 further radiological accidents at the on-site reactors in 1964 and 1969. Corporate control of the site was transferred to North American Rockwell in 1967, when North American Aviation merged with Rockwell Standard. The name changed again in 1973 to Rockwell International, which retained responsibility for the Santa Susana Field Lab until Rockwell International sold its defense and space divisions to Boeing in 1996. The Rocketdyne division was then sold to Pratt & Whitney in 2005. 2006, the Santa Susana Field Laboratory was closed as the R&D projects conducted there were brought to an end. What was left was a site that was highly contaminated, being described at one point by Jared Blumenfeld, the head of the California Environmental Protection Agency, as, quote, one of the most toxic sites in the United States by any definition. We've already talked about the levels of contamination found in the soil. And while it was one thing in 1947 when the area was sparsely populated, by the time the site was closed, even the immediate area was heavily populated, with up to 750,000 people living within several miles of the site and only 30 miles from downtown Los Angeles. Cleaning the site was identified as necessary, and pursuant to that goal, the state of California signed separate agreements with Boeing and the Environmental Research and Development Administration, as one of the successors to the AEC, after it was dissolved in 1975, in order to decontaminate the site to a level deemed safe enough to allow human agriculture to take place. However, delays in this decontamination have been ongoing, and as of the writing of this episode, work has yet to begin, and efforts at delaying the work further, and even secret appeals to the state of California to lower the decontamination standard in order to reduce costs have been attempted. In the meantime, residents near the Santa Susana site have experienced elevated and ongoing health concerns. According to a study led by epidemiologist Hal Morgenstern of the University of Michigan, for the period 1988 through 1995, we found that the incidence rate was more than 60% greater among residents living within 2 miles of SSFL than among residents living more than 5 miles from SSFL for the following types of cancer: thyroid, upper aerodigestive tract, including oral and nasal cavities, pharynx, larynx, and esophagus; bladder and blood and lymph tissue, including leukemias, lymphomas, and multiple myelomas. While it is possible that it is merely coincidence, it is highly unlikely. So, other than this being an interesting and relatively little-known corner of the Cold War, what does the Santa Susana Field Laboratory tell us? Well, it highlights how the U.S. chose to conduct its research via private corporations, although with government involvement and direction. Innovative thinking, new designs, private capital, all of those things that capitalism is renowned for drove the work at the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. But the flip side to this has been ongoing efforts by these private companies to avoid taking responsibility for the health and safety challenges their pursuit of profit created. Just like in the Soviet Union, as evidenced by something like the Kishtin disaster, secrecy prevailed and responsibility was shirked. I'm not suggesting that there was a common motivation, because there wasn't, but the ultimate outcomes have been remarkably similar. Another legacy of the Cold War. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you press the subscribe button as well as the bell button, which spent the day venting radioactive gas by opening the back door of the house. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through a YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.